The tunnels beneath Syrah had always smelled the same. Whetstone, burned powder, the iron tang of blood that no soldier ever quite stopped noticing, no matter how many years he carried a rifle. Marcus Fenix moved through that darkness the way a man moves through a memory he cannot escape. Shoulders low, lancer raised, breath measured into the slow rhythm that had kept him alive longer than most men he had ever served beside. Behind him, what was left of Delta Squad followed in silence. Ahead of him, the Locust remnants waited. Not an army anymore. Something worse, something cornered. And cornered things, Marcus knew, always bit hardest before they died. The mission was simple in the way that only impossible missions ever are. Push deep. Reach the experimental power core the COG scientists had buried in the lower vaults. Detonate it. End the last echo of a war that had already taken everything a man could lose, and then taken a little more for good measure. He could hear the hum before he saw the light. A low, wrong vibration that climbed up through the soles of his boots and settled somewhere behind his teeth. The corridor opened into a chamber so vast that his helmet lamp could not find the far wall, and at its center, suspended in a cradle of black metal and arcing blue fire, was the core. It looked less like a weapon and more like something the universe had not given permission to exist. The scientists had called it an energy bridge. Marcus had stopped listening at that point. To him, it was a bomb, and bombs were tools, and tools were things you used until the war was finally over. He gave the order. The charges were set. Delta fell back. And then, as Marcus turned to follow, the core did something it was not supposed to do. It opened. There was no explosion, no fire, no sound at all, which was the part that would stay with him longest. A perfect circle of light bloomed outward from the cradle, soft and patient, like a sunrise that had wandered into the wrong world. He felt his armor lift. He felt the floor leave him. He had time to think one short, ugly word, and then the light folded around him like a hand closing over a coin, and Marcus Fenix was gone. He woke on grass. That was the first thing his mind refused to accept. Green, living uncrushed. No craters, no ash, no distant artillery painting the horizon orange. He pushed himself up on one elbow and listened, because listening had kept him alive when seeing had failed. And what he heard was worse than any sound a battlefield had ever made. He heard nothing dangerous. Somewhere far away, the soft thrum of an engine that did not belong to any vehicle he recognized. He stood slowly, lancer still in his hands, and turned in a full circle. A city rose in the distance. Clean line. Transports drifting between spires without smoke, without fear, without the hunched urgency of evacuation. Above it all, a sky so blue it looked painted, and crossing that sky impossibly high. The silver shape of a starship moving the way a fish moves through still water. Marcus lowered his weapon, but only by an inch. He had seen places pretend to be peaceful before. Settlements that smiled in the morning and screamed by nightfall. Whole towns that the Locust had walked into wearing the faces of friends. Peace, in his experience, was the quiet a predator left behind when it was deciding which throat to take first. A small craft descended toward him, gentle as a falling leaf. It made no threat displays. It carried no visible guns. A hatch opened and figures stepped out in soft uniforms of black and red and gold, their hands empty, their voices calm. They spoke to him in his own language, which should not have been possible, and they used a word he had not heard spoken aloud in years without bitterness clinging to it. Welcome. Marcus did not lower the rifle the rest of the way. He looked past them at the impossible city, at the impossible sky, at the impossible quiet, and he felt something cold settle in his chest that was not quite fear and not quite hope, because in his experience, peace never lasted, and peace this perfect had to be hiding something terrible. They took him aboard a starship. That was the word they used, and Marcus turned it over in his mouth like a stone, because the ships he had known crawled on treads or coughed through the air on dying engines, and this thing he was walking through now sang. The corridors hummed with a soft, constant music of machinery that did not strain, did not wound, did not beg to be allowed to fail. The walls were clean. The lights were warm. Somewhere faintly he could hear someone laughing. He kept waiting for the trick. The captain who greeted him was a woman with steady eyes and no visible weapon, and she did not flinch when he kept his lancer slung across his back instead of surrendered. She offered him water. She offered him a chair. She offered him answers, slowly, the way a person offers food to a wounded animal. And Marcus accepted none of them at first because accepting things was how soldiers got killed. He watched the crew instead. There were officers, yes, but they did not move like the COG officers he remembered. They did not bark. They did not posture. They listened. He watched a young ensign disagree openly with a senior officer about a navigation course, and instead of being struck down for insubordination, the ensign was thanked. Marcus stood very still when he saw that, because something inside him, some old hard knot of expectation, did not know what to do with the moment. He learned their words slowly. Starfleet. The phrase that struck him hardest was the one they spoke most casually. To seek out, not to conquer, not to crush, to seek, as if the galaxy were not a thing to be survived, but a thing to be met. They showed him their worlds. He stood on a colony where children ran between gardens that no one had to guard. He walked through a city where the markets were full and the soldiers were few, and the few soldiers there laughed with the civilians as if they were neighbors, because they were. He saw a hospital that turned no one away, and a school that taught languages he had never heard of, and a docking yard where ships were being built not for war but for the simple, stunning purpose of going somewhere new. He did not speak much during those days. Marcus Fenix had never been a man who spoke much. But the captain noticed that he had stopped sleeping with his hand on his weapon, and she did not mention it, which was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had done for him in 20 years. One evening he stood at an observation port and watched a nebula unfold across the void, vast and slow and impossibly beautiful, the kind of sight that the war on Syrah would have permitted no one the time to see. He thought of Dom. He thought of his father. He thought of every name carved into every wall of every ruined city he had ever walked through, and he understood, with a quiet that surprised him, that those names had died believing the future was a thing that ended. But here the future had not ended. Here the future was a place people were still walking toward. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a thought he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten where it was. He thought, maybe humanity is not just what survives. Maybe humanity is what survival was supposed to make possible. He did not say it aloud. He did not trust it yet. The soldier in him still waited for the ambush, still measured every doorway, still counted every exit. But the man in him, the part that had been bleeding quietly for decades beneath the armor, lifted its head for the first time in a long time and looked, truly looked, at the stars. And the stars, for once, did not look back like enemies. They looked back like something a person could belong to. The first sign was a silence. A long-range science vessel stopped reporting in. Not a distress call, not a final transmission. Just a clean, complete absence where a voice should have been. The Federation responded the way the Federation always responded, with patience, with curiosity, with the assumption that something could be explained. Marcus was in the briefing room when the report came in, and he felt the old thing in his chest move before anyone else in the room had stopped reading. He had heard silences like that before. On Syrah, when a forward outpost went quiet, it was never because the radio was broken. It was because there was no one left to hold it. A second vessel disappeared 3 days later. Then a mining colony on the far edge of an unexplored sector lost contact in the middle of a routine shift change, mid-sentence, the operator simply not finishing the word she had begun. Strange signals began drifting in from the dark, signals that did not match any known language. Signals that seemed to listen back when Starfleet tried to answer them. The captains gathered. The admiral spoke. They used careful words. First contact protocol. Possible misunderstanding. Cultural barriers. Marcus listened with his arms folded and his jaw set, and when at last they asked his opinion, he gave it in 5 short words. Something out there is hunting. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of disagreement, but the deeper quiet of people who had never had to consider what he was saying. The captain who had welcomed him aboard met his eyes across the table, and he saw in her face that she understood, even if she did not yet want to. Starfleet did what Starfleet did. They sent envoys. They prepared linguistic teams. They drafted greetings in 100 forms, ready to be transmitted the moment a face appeared on a view screen. Marcus did not argue. He had learned in his short time among them that arguing with hope was like arguing with the tide. You could shout at it all you liked. It came in anyway. So instead, while the diplomats prepared their words, Marcus prepared for what words could not stop. He walked the lower decks. He spoke with the security officers, the ones who carried sidearms and trained in the holodecks and were politely tolerated by a society that no longer quite believed it needed them. He asked them what they had. He asked them what they could do. He asked them, quietly, what they were prepared to lose. They did not always have answers, but they began slowly to think about the questions. He studied the maps. He studied the patterns of disappearance, the geometry of the silences, the way the missing ships and the lost colonies formed a shape that was not random. He had seen that shape before, drawn in different ink on different worlds. It was the shape of a hand closing. When the next ship vanished, it was a passenger transport, civilian, families aboard. The Federation responded with mourning and resolve and another offer of dialogue, broadcast into the dark on every frequency they could spare. The dark answered. It answered with a single image, transmitted on a Federation frequency, sent from a Federation registry that should not have existed. The image showed the bridge of the vanished transport empty, the lights still on, the chairs neatly arranged, the consoles untouched. No bodies, no blood, no struggle. Just an absence so complete it felt deliberate. Marcus stood in front of that image for a long time. The diplomats spoke of psychological warfare. The scientists spoke of unknown technologies. Marcus said nothing because he already knew what he was looking at. He was looking at a message. The message said, "We have studied you, and we are not afraid." And somewhere behind his ribs, the old soldier woke fully for the first time since the light had taken him, and he understood, with a sorrow that surprised him, that this peaceful future was about to learn the oldest lesson his world had ever taught him. Hope undefended does not survive contact with hunger. They did not listen at first. That was not their fault exactly. They had been taught, for generations, that listening was a virtue, and that listening hardest to the voices that frightened you was the surest path to wisdom. So when Marcus Fenix stood in their war rooms and spoke in the flat, certain tones of a man who had already buried this scenario a dozen times in his life, they listened the way they had been trained to listen, which is to say, they heard the words and then politely set them aside. He told them the enemy would feign retreat. The enemy feigned retreat. He told them the enemy would target civilian routes first, not military ones, because civilian routes were where the Federation kept its conscience. The enemy targeted civilian routes. He told them the enemy would offer a truce, and that the truce would be a knife. The truce came. The knife came with it. After the third prediction proved exact, an admiral asked him, in a voice carefully scrubbed of feeling, how he had known. Marcus looked at the admiral for a long moment before answering, and when he answered, he did not raise his voice. "I know," he said, "because I am what your people have not had to be in a very long time." The room did not like that answer. The room did not have to like it. The answer was already true. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his presence began to change the shape of the meetings. He was no longer a curiosity at the back of the room. He was given a chair at the table, then a voice in the planning. Then, eventually, a role no one quite knew how to title, because Starfleet had no rank for what he was. He was not an officer. He was not a diplomat. He was something older and rougher, and the captains began to admit privately to one another, something they had perhaps grown too proud to keep among themselves. He was a soldier, and not the kind their training simulations had imagined. The younger officers struggled with him. He could see it in their faces. He spoke too plainly. He looked at maps the way a butcher looks at a carcass, finding the joints, the soft places, the lines along which a thing would come apart. When he recommended an evacuation, he did not soften the number of those who would not make it. When he recommended a strike, he did not pretend the strike would be clean. He had no patience for the small dishonesties that polite societies use to spare themselves from the weight of their own decisions. But he never lied to them, not one. And the older officers, the ones who had seen enough of the dark places between stars to suspect what those places contained, began to notice that his honesty did not come from cruelty. It came from grief. There was a night, late in the campaign, when the captain who had first welcomed him aboard found him standing alone on an observation deck, looking out at a field of stars that had grown quieter than they should have been. She stood beside him for a while without speaking, because she had learned that he did not require speech to know he was no longer alone. Eventually she said, "You do not enjoy this." Marcus did not turn his head. "No," he said. "Then why," she asked, "do you keep doing it?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he had decided not to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, almost gentle, the way a man speaks when he is telling the truth to someone he has decided to trust. "Because I have already paid for it," he said. "I have already paid for knowing. If your people had to learn what I know, the price would break them. So I pay it again. Until you do not need me to." She did not answer. There was no answer that would not have made the moment smaller than it was. After that night, the resistance among the younger officers did not vanish, but it changed. They still did not love him. They still did not want a man like him to be necessary. But they began to understand, in the quiet way that hard truths are understood, that a peaceful society does not stop needing people who understand war. It only stops noticing them. And when it stops noticing them, it forgets how to survive the moments when peace alone is not enough. Marcus Fenix had become the thing the Federation had not wanted to remember. And the Federation slowly was remembering. The offensive came at dawn, though dawn meant nothing in the void. It came in waves, vast and coordinated, and the Federation, for all its wisdom, had not seen a war of this size in living memory. Outposts on the rim fell in hours. Colonies that had stood for generations went dark within a single rotation. Starships that had been built for exploration found themselves suddenly asked to be something else, and many of them, gloriously, terribly, tried. Marcus watched the reports come in from a command deck that smelled of ozone and coffee, and the particular sweat of people who had never expected to be afraid in their own home, and he did what he had always done. He went to work. He did not take command. Starfleet did not give it, and he did not ask. What he did was stand at the shoulder of those who held command, and he spoke when speaking helped, and he stayed silent when silence helped more. He drew lines on holographic maps where lines needed drawing. He suggested feints. He suggested sacrifices, and when he suggested sacrifices, he suggested them with a face that made clear he understood exactly what the word cost. He led from the front when the front needed leading. He boarded a crippled cruiser through a breach that any sane officer would have refused, and he came back out of it with 20 crewmen alive who would otherwise have been names on a wall. He held a corridor on a besieged station for 6 hours with a borrowed phaser rifle in one hand and his old, scarred Lancer in the other, and the security officers who held it with him would speak of those 6 hours in low voices for the rest of their lives. The captains learned, in the heat of those days, what kind of soldier had walked into their world. He did not break. That was the part that astonished them most. They had expected, perhaps, a brutal man, a violent man, a man hardened past the reach of feeling. What they found instead was a man who felt everything, who remembered every name, who carried every loss like a stone in his coat, and who simply, stubbornly, refused to put any of it down until the work was finished. There was a moment near the middle of the siege when a young captain wept openly on the bridge after losing half her crew to a boarding action. She did not try to hide it. She had been raised in a society where grief was not shameful, and she let it come. Marcus stood near her, his arms at his sides, his face unreadable. And when she finally lifted her eyes to him, expecting perhaps judgment, he said only one thing. "Good," he said. "Never lose that." She did not understand him at first. She understood him later. The hardest hour came at a place the Federation would later simply call the crossing, a choke point in the lane, a narrow piece of dark between two stars where the enemy fleet had to pass, and where the Federation, if it was to break the offensive, had to hold. The numbers were not in their favor. The numbers had not been in their favor for some time. Marcus stood on the flagship beside an admiral whose hands were trembling very slightly, and he said the thing the admiral could not bring himself to say. "We hold here," Marcus said, "or we lose everything behind us. There is no third option." The admiral decided. The order went out, and the Federation in that hour did something it had not done in generations. It planted its feet in the dark and refused to move. Ships burned. Friends died. A science vessel rammed an enemy dreadnought rather than allow it through, and her captain's last transmission was not a curse, was not a prayer, was simply the names of her crew, read aloud, slowly, until the signal cut. Marcus heard it from the bridge of the flagship and bowed his head. Just once, the way he had bowed his head over Dom, the way he had bowed his head over his father, the way a man bows his head when there is nothing else left to give but the small dignity of acknowledgement. When the line held, when the last enemy wave finally broke against the Federation's stubborn, weeping refusal to fall, Marcus did not cheer. He did not smile. He simply set down his rifle on the console beside him, and he looked, for a long moment, at the people around him, these soft people, these hopeful people, these people who had been told all their lives that they would never have to be this, and who had been this anyway, and his face did something it had not done in a very long time. It softened, because for the first time in his life Marcus Fenix had fought beside an army that was not fighting to survive. It was fighting to remain itself, and it had won. Victory did not feel the way victory had felt on Syrah. On Syrah, when a battle ended, the silence afterward had always been the silence of subtraction. Fewer voices, fewer footsteps, the slow, grinding awareness that the world had become smaller by exactly the weight of those who would not be coming back. Marcus had carried that silence inside him for so long that he had stopped recognizing it as a wound. Here, the silence after the siege was different. There were still the missing. There were still the names. The Federation would spend years carving those names into walls, speaking them aloud on remembrance days, teaching them to children who would grow up knowing that their easy mornings had been bought. But beneath the grief, woven through it, there was something Marcus had never felt in the aftermath of his own wars. There was a future on the other side of it. He walked the hallways of a hospital ship in the days after the crossing, and he saw things that did not fit the shape of any victory he had ever known. He saw a young officer, both legs gone, laughing at something a friend had said. He saw a science team that had lost half its members already arguing, gently, over what they would name the new star they had charted during the retreat. He saw a chaplain of a faith Marcus had never heard of sitting quietly beside a sleeping enemy prisoner, not guarding her, just sitting, so that she would not wake alone. That last one stopped him. He stood in the doorway for a long time, his hands hanging useless at his sides, and he watched a man keep watch over an enemy not because the enemy was dangerous, but because the enemy was afraid. And something in Marcus Fenix, some old armored thing that had been welded shut around his heart since before he could remember, made a small, tired sound and began, very slowly, to come apart. He thought of the prisoners his own world had taken. He thought of how few of them had ever lived to be sat beside. The captain found him later on the observation deck again, because that had become their place without either of them ever having said so. She did not ask him what was wrong. She had learned by then that Marcus did not need to be drawn out. He would speak when the words had finished assembling themselves. After a while he spoke. "I used to think hope was weakness," he said. She waited. "I used to think," he said, "that the people who believed in better days were the people who had not yet had enough days taken from them. I thought hope was what you had before the world taught you not to." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, a repair crew was at work on a battered hull, their small lights moving like fireflies against the black. "I was wrong," he said. She did not answer. She did not have to. "Hope," he said, more slowly now, as if he were assembling the thought for the first time in his life. "Hope is not what you have before the world hurts you. Hope is what you choose after. Hope is the harder thing. Hope is what makes survival mean anything at all." He turned his head and looked at her, and his eyes were very tired and very clear. "Your people," he said. "Your people are not naive. I thought they were. I was wrong about that too. Your people are brave in a way my people forgot how to be. You looked at the dark and you decided anyway to build something gentle in it. That is not weakness. That is the bravest thing I have ever seen." She did not weep, but she came close. She reached out and she put her hand on his armored shoulder and she left it there. And Marcus Fenix, for the first time in more years than he could count, did not flinch from being touched. He never wore the uniform. They offered it more than once. A place at the long table where the captains gathered and the future was argued over in the careful, hopeful voices he had come, against all his expectations to love. He always refused, gently, and they always understood, because by then they had learned who he was, and they had learned that who he was could not be folded into a uniform without losing some essential, necessary part of itself. So he remained what he had always been. But he remained it differently now. He took long walks on the colony worlds he had helped to save. He sat in gardens where children ran past him without fear, and he let them run. He learned the names of the captain's children. He learned, slowly, terribly, to laugh again in short, rough bursts that surprised him more than anyone else. He visited the memorial walls, and he ran his hand over the carved names of officers he had stood beside. And he did not flinch from them, because he had learned, finally, that remembering the dead is not a wound. It is a debt, and debts paid with love are not heavy. He stood, one evening, on the observation deck of a starship that was preparing to leave on a long mission of exploration, not war. The captain had asked him to come aboard for the departure, and he had come, because he had learned that being asked was a thing to be honored. The stars stretched out before him, vast and patient and full. He thought of Syrah. He thought of the tunnels. He thought of the boy he had been before the war, the man he had become during it, and the stranger he was becoming now, here, among these soft, brave people who had taught him, without ever meaning to, that a life could be more than the sum of what it had survived. The Federation would remember him. In the centuries that followed, his name would appear in their histories the way certain rare names do, half legend, half warning. The soldier from a forgotten war. The man who taught a peaceful future that peace, to last, must be willing to be defended. Children would learn his name in schools on worlds he had never seen. Captains, generations later, would speak of him in quiet moments before difficult decisions, and they would feel, somehow, that he was listening. But that was for the future. In the present, Marcus Fenix stood at a window and watched the stars, and he felt, for the first time in a life that had been built entirely out of endings, the strange and unfamiliar shape of a beginning. He had spent his whole life surviving. He set the rifle down gently, and he smiled, and he began at last to live.